Good evening. You're watching Left, Right and Centre. I'm Vishnu Shom. It is a very sad day for the armed forces in this country, for the nation, in a sense, with the loss of General Bipin Rawat, India's first Chief of Defence Staff. 13 of 14 people on the Indian Air Force helicopter that he was on are dead after a helicopter crash shortly after 12 p.m. this afternoon. He was on his way to Wellington, where there is a Defence Services and Staff College, where he was supposed to speak. What you actually see on the screen is the Indian Air Force Mi-17 V5, the very same helicopter that he was on today. And we can actually show you the image of the wreck at this stage. The image of the wreck shows the same tail number of the helicopter that you see there. So if we can change the image to show the next one of the Mi-17 V5, you can see the tail boom over there and the numbers match. So the picture on top of a better time, that's the same helicopter which crashed. But lots of important questions being asked at this stage. The key question is this: what about the role of Chief of Defence Staff? Will India see a new Chief of Defence Staff very soon? Why? Because the Chief of Defence Staff plays a critical role in the nuclear command authority in this country. Therefore, there is a requirement for this post to be filled. But what really went wrong in this crash? We will not be speculating at all on this program. An inquiry has been started. A very senior Air Force officer is looking into this. But at the moment, the news of the death of General Bipin Rawat, his wife, and several other officers and enlisted men of the armed forces is creating real shockwaves across this country. Firstly, Air Chief Marshal, your thoughts at this very sad accident today.
A black day indeed. And to begin with, my deepest condolences to the families of General Rawat, Mrs. Rawat, the crew and the passengers who perished in this very, very unfortunate crash. As you just read out the Army Chief's communique on the sad incident, I think General Rawat, the very first Chief of Defence Staff of our country, had done yeoman service in his tenure to bring about jointmanship and to initiate many other moves in the armed forces for joint fighting and making the higher defense organization of the country stronger, firmer, and more responsive to the many challenges that we may have to face as the days go by.
Sir, tell us a little bit about the Mi-17 V5 helicopter. Firstly, does this variant of the helicopter have a digital flight data recorder and a cockpit voice recorder, which are essential to try and figure out what went wrong?
It does. It does. And I know the Mi-17 very intimately because I inducted the Mi-17 helicopter into the Air Force and raised the very first squadron of this helicopter. And in as far as all the variants of the Mi-17 are concerned, the V5 is the latest with a glass cockpit, and it's a wonderful helicopter. I've flown thousands of hours on this helicopter in the most challenging terrain of this country, from the Siachen Glacier to everywhere else. And its performance, I mean, as a matter of fact, Indians should be very proud of the Mi-17 because with many inputs which we gave the Russians after operating the Mi-8s for such a long time, they came out with an excellent helicopter with better power and better flying characteristics. And as far as the helicopter is concerned, it's one of the finest for our requirements in the country. And it has flown hundreds of thousands of hours with the Indian Air Force. And we have a fairly large fleet of this helicopter with us. and it is the backbone of helicopter medium lift operations in the country today.
Yeah.
It's an excellent helicopter, and I'm sure that as we go along, we will find out as to what went wrong in this accident. The FDR and the cockpit voice recorder will certainly bring out good information about the sequence of events which happened, and also give us some kind of an idea as to what actually happened. Because speculating on what happened would be stupid on anyone's part at this stage.
Air Chief, how much time does it take to actually process the data in a flight data recorder, and do we have the equipment to do that here, or does that need to go back to Russia?
I'm not very sure about the Mi-17 V5, whether we have the equipment here to process the data. But even if it has to go back to Russia for the processing, irrespective of how much time it takes, I cannot tell you or give you a timeline because I'm not aware of it. And but it will happen, and provided, of course, the flight data recorder and the CVR are in a reasonable state of recovery from the crash site.
That's really important. It's designed to sustain a crash,
Absolutely.
but then obviously there was a fire here as well. So that is a complication in terms of recovery of this equipment.
Eventually, I'm quite sure they will recover it in whatever form it is.
Whether there was a distress call or not, the last few moments or minutes of that flight would also be something that we're looking at very carefully, right? Maybe there was no distress call, and that in itself would be an indicator of, something sudden. If there was a distress call, then there'd be a clearer indicator that they were in trouble.
Vishnu, in the absence of any information available at this stage, it is very difficult to say whether a distress call was given, what were the flight conditions, etc.
Yeah.
And I think we should wait for a while before more facts emerge before we even discuss a thing like this.
Got it. Air Chief Marshal, have you flown into Wellington personally in a helicopter? Have you commanded a helicopter into Wellington?
Yes, I have, many times.
And so therefore, could you just tell us about the lay of the land? Have you landed a Mi-8 or a Mi-17 in Wellington, sir, personally?
Both. I've landed a Mi-8 and a Mi-17.
Could you tell us a little bit about the lay of the land? Your experience, just in simple terms.
You see, if my memory serves me right, the helipad height of Wellington, it's not very high. I think it's less than 5,000 feet. So that's no altitude for a Mi-17 to cause any problems. And even the hills there are not very high, probably maybe at 2 kilometers or a little higher than 2 kilometers, you can cross all hills in the Nilgiris. The terrain is like any other hilly state, undulating land starting from Coimbatore, from Sulur, as you come up to Wellington. And the flying time is very short. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the flying time from Sulur to Wellington is just about 20 minutes, I think, 20 or 25 minutes.
I see.
And so that's what I'm saying. On such a short flight duration, what could have gone wrong is very difficult to determine at this stage.
No, and I won't speculate. I take that point. There could be multiple reasons, and we won't know until we actually know. Have you flown the Mi-17 V5?
No, I haven't flown the V5.
The V5 has, besides anything else,
much later.
Right. It has more power, right? It has more power. It has a glass cockpit. In other words, avionics far superior. Yeah. An easier aircraft to fly as well, I would assume. Better
avionics, a better autopilot. It is an improvement on the previous version of the Mi-7.
Right. Air Chief, anything further that you'd like to? Just one more question, as I think out, loud as I speak to you. If there is a Chief of Defence Staff or an Army, Air Force, Navy chief on board, typically, would this aircraft not have been examined perhaps even more closely than normally, which might be just a normal thing to do, that, there are officers, engineering officers and others saying, oh, the CDS is coming, VVIPs are coming, let's make sure everything is perfect. Because in a rank conscious setup, which the Indian Armed Forces are, there is always an effort to look out for the senior most. Would this not have been a natural thing which could have happened?
Vishnu, it's like this. Any aircraft in the Air Force, whether it's a Mi-17 or any other aeroplane, will not fly if there is any problem with it. It won't be declared fit for flying. And secondly, yes, if there are, there are more a little more attention on the aircraft when you have a VIP or a VVIP on board, no doubt about it. But what I'm trying to say is that you will never ever take off in an aircraft which is unserviceable, especially with the CDS on board.
The remains of the Air Force chopper carrying India's first Chief of Defence Staff, General Bipin Rawat, and 12 others died in the crash on a steep hillside in Coonoor in Tamil Nadu. General Rawat was on his way to address faculty and student officers of the Staff College in Wellington. The crash, described as a tragic accident by the Air Force, happened around noon. The sole survivors, Group Captain Varun Singh, he's still being treated for severe burns at the military hospital in Wellington. At 9 a.m., General Bipin Rawat and 13 others left Delhi on board a special aircraft. At 11:35, General Bipin Rawat reached the Sulu Air Base at Coimbatore for a short helicopter flight to Wellington. At 11:45 a.m., the Chief of Defence Staff left from Coimbatore for the Defence Services Staff College in Wellington on board an Mi-17 V5 helicopter with 14 people, including crew on board. At noon, the Indian Air Force Mi-17 V5 helicopter crashes near Coonoor, Tamil Nadu, 14 kilometers from Wellington. Authorities will be conducting an inquiry, but many experts are surprised by the crash. The helicopter, a Russian-designed Mi-17 V5, was a recent variant and seen as reliable.
It's a wonderful helicopter. I've flown thousands of hours on this helicopter in the most challenging terrain of this country, from the Siachen Glacier to everywhere else. And as far as the helicopter is concerned, it's one of the finest for our requirements in the country.
Defence Minister Rajnath Singh visited General Rawat's residence in Delhi after briefing the Prime Minister. The Rawats have 2 daughters. Later at 6 p.m, the Indian Air Force confirmed in a tweet that General Bipin Rawat, his wife Mrs. Madhulika Rawat and 11 others have died in the crash. In the evening, the Prime Minister chaired a top-level security meeting with the top 4 ministers as well as the National Security Advisor. The remains of the General, his wife and others will be brought to the national capital tomorrow. NDTV Bureau Report.
General Bipin Rawat had a key role in the armed forces. As the first Chief of Defence Staff of India, his role was to ensure that the armed forces stopped working in silos, to ensure that the forces were integrated. He had lots of ideas, some of them just in the process of starting to be implemented. Any new CDS, Chief of Defence Staff, that India has will be absolutely key in trying to take forward this process.
63-year-old General Bipin Rawat led the Indian Army and then the military as India's first Tri-Services Chief for the last 5 years. A very challenging period which saw fatal clashes with Pakistani and Chinese troops and many other crises. He took over as Army Chief in December 2016 after superseding 2 seniors. He was selected for his experience in cross-border strikes. In 2015, following the killing of 18 Indian soldiers in an ambush by Naga rebels, the Indian forces responded with cross-border strikes and the responsibility of coordination was on Lieutenant General Rawat. General Rawat took over as Army Chief in the aftermath of the strikes across the line of control in September 2016, conducted by India after Pakistani-based groups attacked an army camp in Uri. Earlier that year, terrorists had attacked the Air Force base in Pathankot.
I said the surgical strikes were a message that we had communicated, and that if required, and if the adversary does not behave, then if we have to continue with these kind of activities and events, we will continue.
In his tenure after the horrific Pulwama bomb attack in which 40 CRPF personnel were killed, India carried out second cross-border attack against a terror camp in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. An escalation which led to a counter-attack by Pakistan's Air Force, which was repelled by India. Later that year, on his retirement, General Rawat was appointed as India's first Chief of Defence Staff. But already the tension with China was building up on several fronts. In Arunachal Pradesh, with repeated face-offs. In Doklam, in Bhutan across the Sikkim border, where the Chinese built a base. And most crucially, in many areas in Ladakh. Along the line of actual control, repeated confrontations flared up with the Galwan clash in which a colonel was among 20 Indian soldiers and several Chinese reportedly. This was the first fatal clash with China since the 1962 war. General Rawat's biggest strategic challenge was the possibility of war with India's nuclear-armed neighbours. Key to this was updating India's arsenal both with indigenous and foreign weapons, including more and more from the US.
Constant friction with two of our nuclear-armed neighbours, with whom India has fought wars, increasingly acting in collision, poses an omnipresent danger of regional strategic instability with the potential for escalation, threatening our territorial integrity and strategic cohesion.
During his term, the government also pushed for making roads, bridges, homes in border areas. Internally, not one to shy away from controversy, General Rawat cut through red tape and honoured Major Litul Gogoi for tying up a Kashmiri stone pelter to his vehicle as a human shield to evacuate polling staff. The Major was awarded the Chief of Army Staff Commendation Card. During the movement against the controversial Citizenship Amendment Act, across the country he publicly condemned those who were leading the protests and said, leadership wasn't about guiding people to carry out arson and violence.
Leaders are not those who lead people in inappropriate directions, as we are witnessing in a large number of university and college students, the way they are leading masses of crowds to carry out arson and violence.
General Rawat's tenure has also seen a landmark change, with doors opening for regular commission of women in several sectors.
Well, the training of the women soldiers in the Indian Army in particular has been hard, and it has held them in good stead in performing their tasks in various kinds of terrain that we have in our country.
The distinction between the role of men and women today in war fighting is getting blurred by the day. The notion of gender gap is passé. Women are no less suited to braving such challenging conditions and have proven themselves in the past and will continue to do so in the future.
As the Chief of the Tri-Services, General Rawat had begun to plan for a better coordination between the three forces, especially in long-term procurement. He had a year of service left.
I also spoke to the former Army Chief, General Deepak Kapoor, on his memory of General Bipin Rawat and what the loss means to the armed forces. General, how is it very important at this juncture, with a great deal of alacrity, for the Indian Air Force to get to the bottom of what exactly has taken place? For an accident like this to take place, with such a senior officer on board, it raises all sorts of questions, whether it was pilot error or whether it was a mechanical fault. India needs to know, therefore, how important is it for a speedy investigation?
As far as my experience goes, Vishnu, I can say this, that when the Air Force details a helicopter for a senior dignitary like the Army Chief or the CDS or any other important dignitary, they go through a number of checks, and I'm sure those would have also been gone through. The rating of a pilot who generally flies is also extremely high, while the Court of Inquiry will definitely establish as to what could be the cause, the pilot error, mechanical problems. As far as the reliability of the machine is concerned, it has proved its worth a number of times through worst areas, through different difficult areas, and that also perhaps would be examined by the Court of Inquiry. But the weather, as I was pointing out to you earlier, it plays a lot of tricks, especially in the area of Kunur, Wellington. you find that the clouds come in generally from the area of the Kotagiri side or Ooty, and certainly you find that the weather goes duff. So the possibility of weather playing a crucial role in this accident can also not be ruled out.
General Kapoor, there's a statement from the Defence Minister. I'm reading it out. Rajnath Singh writes, deeply anguished by the sudden demise of the Chief of Defence Staff, General Rawat, his wife, and 11 other personnel, armed forces personnel, in an extremely unfortunate helicopter accident today in Tamil Nadu. His untimely death is an irreparable loss to our armed forces and the country. General, what happens now as far as the structure of the armed forces is concerned? Is there an immediate move to fill this vacancy? And the reason I say so is because General Rawat was very important in the structure, for example, the nuclear command structure of our country. He had a critical role right on top. So therefore, does his absence need to be filled right away as part of a national security requirement?
Vishnu, these are some of the institutional posts, very important posts, and I agree with you that whether it is the CDS or the Army Chief or certain other higher posts, they need to be filled as early as possible. The fact that the Government of India had created just about a couple of years back the post of the CDS, that's a credit to the government, because there is definitely a requirement to develop jointness, which has not come about so swiftly in the Indian military, unlike other countries like the US, China and others. So to that extent, the creation of a CDS was an extremely important step and was done at the right time. And what General Rawat was pursuing was bringing about jointness as quickly and as early as possible. Now, I think the biggest tribute to him would be to ensure that that jointness for which he was working is brought about as quickly as possible, and the aspect of theaterization, etc., which one doesn't want to go in detail at this time, is definitely the right way to pay a handsome tribute to his great memory.
General Kapoor, in addition to General Rawat and his wife, there were very senior military personnel on board that helicopter, including a group captain who I mentioned, but there were others who were on the manifest of the aircraft which he flew from Delhi to Tamil Nadu, to Coimbatore, to Sulur, before he boarded this helicopter. Now, I'm not going to name them because I'm waiting for the armed forces to name them, but assuming and very likely that they were also on that helicopter, one gentleman was a brigadier, another a lieutenant colonel. There were two Nayaks, a Lance Nayak, two Lance Nayaks and one Havaldar. The enlisted men were his personal security officers. The lieutenant colonel was the staff officer to the Chief of Defence Staff. The brigadier was the DA, I presume Defence Assistant, is that right, DA sir, to the Chief of Defence Staff, in addition to obviously his wife. So in addition to that, of course, very senior pilots in this helicopter, the flight engineer and the two officers flying this helicopter. In as much as we speak about General Rawat, sir, anything you'd like to say, your condolences in the memory of those others who have died as well?
Whenever a military person is lost, there is always grief and sadness. And I've no doubt that the entire crew of the helicopter as well as the passengers were doing their bit in contributing in different ways as far as their duties are concerned to the military. So the demise of any, and so many of them, is indeed a very sad event. And one's heart goes out to their families for the sacrifice that they've had to make. For what reason and how it happened, I suppose later on it will come out in the court of inquiry. But most of these people were there because they were part of the, firstly the crew, secondly the staff of the CDS, thirdly the security personnel along with the CDS, and lastly the group captain who was from the staff college who was travelling with Vishnu Most likely he was the protocol officer who would have been briefing the CDS on what all had to be done immediately on landing at Wellington, since he was supposed to deliver a very important address to the students undergoing the Defence Services Staff College course at the Staff College at Wellington.
Well, as you can expect, there have been lots of reactions from across the country. These are some comments on coup. Pubati writes, "A true warrior never dies. We will never forget your service to the nation." Jatin writes, "The country has lost a super commander who made the country proud." Safar says, "My deep condolences on the demise of 14 people, including the Chief of Defence Staff, General Bipin Rawat, in this unfortunate helicopter crash in Tamil Nadu. It's a national loss to India." Mukund says, "General Rawat was a great soldier, a great leader. It's a massive loss for the nation." Well, we're going to take a short break. Remember the mortal remains of the Chief of Defence Staff, his wife, who was also killed in this crash alongside General Rawat. They've got 2 daughters, remember that, who survived them. And of course the other armed forces personnel who were killed. They will be brought to Delhi, we believe, tomorrow. We expect Rajnath Singh, the Defence Minister, to issue a statement to both houses of Parliament as well. It's a story we'll continue to track very, very closely.